I'll get you next time.
No worries. I know they recorded it, and we're talking about posting it or sharing it some.
Oh, great!
Some way,
I'd love to see it. Maybe you could send it to the board members.
Yeah, I definitely will.
Great.
So I'm going to get us live to Facebook, and then we'll start our conversation.
Oh, okay. So.
Okay. We should be ready to go in just 1 second. And we are recording this just so everybody knows, so that we can post it later and folks can find it online as well. You can share it with your communities. So welcome, everybody. I'm Allison Fine. I am just delighted to be able to host this educational event focused on allyship for African American activism. We frame this as Jewish allyship. However, I think it's all allyship. And we're going to have, we have two really special guests with us who are just spectacular activists and thinkers in this area. And then I hope that we'll have time for questions as well. So if you have a question and you're on the Zoom call, you can just put it right in the chat. Otherwise, if you're on Facebook Live, you can just post it there, and Jessica will share it with me here. So let me introduce my two guests, my two special friends. My first friend is Kimberly Peeler-Allen. Kimberly is I think the preeminent organization recruiting and training African American women to run for office around the country. Kimberly is an activist, a scholar, a thought leader in this area, and a real doer. And I consider her a friend and a mentor. And I'm so glad you're here with us, Kimberly. Thank you for joining us. You know, you're on mute.
Of course.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And my other guest is Rachel Lazar, whom I've known for years. I met Rachel when she was Deputy Director of the Religious Action Center of the Union of Reform Judaism. We served on the board of NARAL, Pro-Choice America Foundation. She's now president of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, here with her activist hat on in her personal capacity, to share years of working on racial justice issues and as being a fantastic ally, as well as a great friend. So thanks for coming, Rachel, as well.
It's so great to be here with everyone. Thanks for having me.
So my first question for Kimberly and Rachel is, do you think this moment in time is different? And if so, why? Why don't you get us started, Kimberly?
I think this moment is different because we're sitting here right now having conversations like this. I have two small children, so I've been like just absolutely stringent about social distancing, and have not been out to any of the protests, or hadn't been out to any of the protests because I was just so afraid of the spread and having another spike here in New York. But we went out to a children's march this weekend, and the variety of voices that are being raised in multiple capacities is something that we've never seen before. We are now, I think it's 16 days in this protest spirit, and 100+ days in COVID quarantine, and 3.5 years into the Trump administration. And I think the energy it's all just been compounding over and over. And we're now at this point where the collective awakening of not just people of color, but white people across the country. People are saying, wait a minute, this can't stand. I didn't realize, or I can't turn a blind eye to it anymore. And I'm going to do something. And I think that is what is really different. The, full age range, socioeconomic, racial, geographic span of the voices that are stepping forward to stand for change and demand change across our government, our society, is really different than anything I've seen in my lifetime. I've talked to my parents about what they saw in the 60s and leading up to it in the civil rights movement, and they've said that it feels somewhat similar, but it is definitely I think there's just a broader scope of voices that are active right now.
Do you ever think you'd hear the phrase "defund the police" become mainstream? Huh? That's something.
Exactly.
Rachel, what do you think? Is it different now?
So it's obviously Kim did a great job of speaking to it. It's hard to speak to it when you weren't there. I was kind of there. Just for the record, my mom had just gotten pregnant with me and was tear gassed at the protest following the MLK Jr. assassination. So I was there in some sense, but not outside of the womb. So I would agree with everything that Kim said. I would say that what I'm seeing happening for white people in particular in my lifetime is this awakening to the fact that we can't trust the police to perform in ways that we want for our country. And that one of the privileges of growing up white, right, is that you grow up overarchingly trusting the police and thinking of the police as good people there to help the country. And that's a very different reality, right? So there's a loss in this awakening to the fact that police are operating largely, not entirely, but largely in ways that are very out of sync with our values and what we want for the country. And the other piece of that is the cost of one of the many costs of white privilege is that we awaken to the fact that we are taught and believe a series of mistruths, really like a series of lies. And that's a lot to wake up to, like, wow, I thought the police were good guys, kind of, mostly. Like, that's very different. And I think that is another sort of big marking of this moment for white people. Right.
And you have certainly taught me an awful lot about white privilege, Rachel. So I'm glad that you're here. I think I've been calling this pandemic a poverty multiplier, and we are so rubbed raw in this moment in time. And I don't think it's any coincidence at all that we are at the greatest distance in income. We have the greatest income inequality in our country since 1968. You can just let that sink in for a second, right? There's a reason why all of this is happening now. So Kimberly, so many people are asking me and asking in general, what can we do to be good allies? So talk to me about what you think a good ally is in this moment, what you hope more people will do, and what you hope people won't do.
Well, I think there's a lot that can be done and needs to be done. I think true allies in this moment have the real opportunity to step forward in places where people of color may not have been able to do so before, because there's the dual track of the message and the messenger. And for, you know, as we have our spheres of influence, and as a great phrase that someone used yesterday that I'm really going to hone in on is, you know, you talked a little bit about white privilege. Spend your privilege and use the opportunity to the fact that you have an audience, or the fact that you have people who will listen to you, use that opportunity to talk about inequality. My apologies for the sirens going by. Inequality, police brutality, racism. When you see someone, you know, say, or you hear someone say something that comes off a little jarring to you, it probably is extremely jarring to the person of color that was receiving that comment. And for you to stand with that person, or even, you know, whether you choose to do it in public or in private, I think just calling it out at any opportunity is tremendously valuable in the immediate of how do you respond to, how do you show up in this movement space, in these protests, putting your body on the line. Putting skin in the game, showing up at a march, and standing shoulder to shoulder. I think one of the most powerful images I've seen was, I forget which city it was, but there were a line of white women that were standing between the police in their riot gear and protesters. And protesters of color, because they recognized that they would be treated differently than the protesters of color. And so they put themselves out there. You know, there are a lot of groups that are working to break down racism, to inform, to educate, criminal justice reform. You know, particularly in this moment, there are many bail funds for protesters. If you have the resources, put your money out there to support the work. And just think of ways that you can engage. And then also think about yourself, do some deep introspection. And it is hard. All of this is really challenging work. It is not going to be comfortable, but recognize that it's not going to be comfortable, but you will be better for it. Yeah. And, you know, think about your own life experience and where privilege has benefited you, where you may have not necessarily thought about it at the time, but where were you possibly given an advantage that a person of color or a Black person would not have been, and analyze that. Yeah. And think about how if you find yourself in a similar situation, will you conduct yourself differently? And I think those types of conversations, and then also, you know, as Rachel said, you know, we were taught, you know, many of us were taught to not to trust the police. Many homes of color, you know, it was like somebody has to be literally dead for you to call the cops, because you don't want to invite that into your home, because the distrust is there. So thinking through, what have you been taught? What is your understanding? What is your understanding of American history? I think so much of where we are right now is, you know, just compounded, not just from the events of the last, you know, 4 years, but, you know, from 1619 and forward. And we are now seeing, you know, really having an opportunity to really analyze, you know, the history texts, who's telling the story, and thinking about what might be missing and going out and finding that. I think there's just a lot of work, individual work, that needs to be done.
I think that's brilliant. I'm going to carry this phrase of spend your privilege with me moving forward, and the idea of sitting with your discomfort. It is not a moment in time to just focus on being nice, but really digging in. And that's the sort of systemic work that we need to uncover. Rachel, tell us, I know you've done so much work in this area of understanding white privilege and challenging it. Tell us your thoughts on this.
On white privilege in general, or on allyship, or get a little more specific? Allyship, maybe.
Yes. Or both. Yes.
Okay, let me start with allyship. I'm not sure even about the word. So when I was starting my own work on white privilege and to try to understand it and understand my own white privilege, I interviewed a Black pastor, Reverend Jennifer Butler, who's a leader in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And the goal was to write an article on how to be a good white ally. So I asked her, can I interview you? Sure. Okay, let me launch into my questions. And she said, actually, can I stop you right there? And I said, oh, what did I, being a little white fragile, like, what did I do? And she said, I'm not sure that the term ally is the best term here, because ally implies a mutuality. Like, I'm going to work for you, you're going to work for me. And in this instance, it's sort of like the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter debate. Like, there's a fire, in the black and brown, towards the black and brown brothers and sisters in our country. And therefore, it's not a mutual exchange right now. Right now, it's about white people being accompaniers, being supporters, as Kim was saying, using our bodies, using our resources, right? As there was a wonderful interview today of Congressman Lewis, and he said, like, his advice was, you only pass this way once, you got to give it all you can. And, like, you just have to kind of keep going and going. And so anyway, I think I would say about the how to become a white supporter of racial justice, or even a Jewish, if I could speak to that for a moment, as I am, supporter of racial justice, that it can be a really powerful tool, even to share, and a point of access, the fact that you are a religious minority, and to share that is often other people who have experiences with being minorities in other realms can relate better to other minorities' experiences, in our country, but that the boundaries are really important, and that Jewish people were not brought to America in chains, and it's just a different situation, and it's really important not to over-relate, So.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask you this, though, because I've been seeing discussions online of white people saying that they're uncomfortable, that they don't want to be in the center of this conversation. And actually, African-American people I've seen who have said, you need to show up for us. So how do we balance both the need to be present, the need to be in this fight together, while also centering the struggle for Black Americans? What do you think, Rachel?
I have found that, I've been to some protests in DC, and my children are young adults, so I'm in a different spot from Kim. They're going to the protest with me. And I have found this amazing environment where so many white people are showing up, and we got the horn honk, like, yay, white people, and there's like a lot of white people even like a Black friend of mine in Raleigh who went to a demonstration in her community said the majority of people there were white. So there's a ton of white people showing up, and I feel like there's a respect for the leadership of the Black and brown community at the same time. So white people aren't kind of leading the chants or dictating kind of where the march goes, or, you know, but we're there in solidarity, and we're there using our bodies, like Kim was saying too.
Right.
You know?
Right. I think of it as being, so maybe instead of allyship, we should talk about being of service to this movement. Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it. What do you think, Kimberly? Is of
I love that. I love that, to be of service.
To be of service.
You know, and to the question about like, how do you properly show up in a respectful manner?
Yeah.
And I think the, you know, to Rachel's point about not being overly, I forget the term that you use, but like, you can't make it about you.
Yeah.
You have to be very clear that you're not there to dissect your personal experience. You're not there to, you know, publicly atone for whatever slight that you may have, or whatever you may have, you know, on your chest. It is about you standing for injustice, standing up and saying no more.
Yeah.
And really just being very clear about the, you know, as the hashtags have been flying around, you know, trust Black women, trust Black leadership, to really guide how, you know, how all of this works, but also be a great supporter of that work and amplify. You know, going back to my earlier statement about it's the message and the messenger.
Yes.
And you could be able to reach someone who would not hear, we could use the exact same words, but it would not resonate coming from me the same way it would come from you. So thinking about how you can take what you are learning and observing in this moment and talk to others who may not have those same conversations. I see so many conversations happening on social media and text strings that are really brave conversations about people saying, this is why I'm fired up about this. I had a high school friend reach out to me and say, you know, for so long, I've just kind of been, you know, not wanted to say the wrong thing. But when I started thinking about how this was directly affecting my friends, I realized I wasn't being a true friend by staying silent.
I love that. That's brilliant. And I would say to people, ask a question if you're nervous about something. So let's get to the roots. I think of systemic change is the difference. There's policy change, and anybody, you know, can have a checklist of policies, and nothing wrong with that. Yes, of course, we should outlaw chokeholds, but that's not systemic change, and that's the difference between going out and plucking up a dandelion by the flower versus really digging in and getting to the roots. So, Kimberly Peeler-Allen, tell me, what does success look like for systemic change for racial equality in this country? What do you want to see done?
I want to see, God, there's so much. I think I would start with our education system.
Okay.
And the a broader perspective of American history, a broader perspective of the diaspora, and teaching about, you know, not whitewashing all of our, you know, every aspect of our education system has been whitewashed and dumbed down. And I think starting with the children, because, you know, we know it's a blank slate. Yeah. And as we teach them, you know, they absorb. So I would start there. I think we need to have, so I saw someone online talking about how we need to have something similar to what they did in South Africa around reconciliation of the acknowledgement of America's original sin and how that has affected and the repercussions of that. And being able to really spend the time dissecting and sitting with that as a country. Yeah. And I think those two pieces, we could go a long way in reshaping how we view ourselves as Americans.
That's super helpful. And if anybody has a question, you can put it in the chat on Zoom or in on the stream on Facebook Live. Rachel, you spent so long at the Religious Action Center. What are your thoughts about ways to reduce hate crimes in this country, or to lower the heat on all the hate that has arisen in the last several years, particularly since Trump was elected?
Enable people to vote.
I thought, Kimberly, I thought you were going to start with voting. Right, voting would help.
So that would be an enormous one.
Yeah.
But I really do believe that, you know, who we elect and who our leaders are reflect and perpetuate both, you know, kind of where the country is. So it sets a real tone. I mean, the number of hate crimes have gone up, not surprisingly, since Trump was president, you know, and so that is very real.
Yeah.
So these elections and the ability of people to vote, you know, the disenfranchisement that we're experiencing across the country, you know, the fear over like USPS shutting down and what are we going to do? I mean, there's just so many components to be mindful of. I will say that there is this human component of sort of getting to know our neighbors, or in the Hebrew Bible, you know, I think it references once being kind to your neighbor, but 36 times being kind to the stranger.
Yes.
And rabbis have interpreted that to mean, well, we have rabbis on the phone, so you guys can correct me, but have interpreted that to mean that it's harder to be kind to a stranger than it is to your neighbor. And, you know, how can we continue to get to know one another beyond a surface level, you know? And I think that will only enhance our ability to understand that we are part of this, you know, shared garment of the MLK quote that I love so much, and I'm going to mess up, so I won't even try it, but how interlinked all of our destinies are, and, you know, and how costly it is to all of our humanity when other of our brothers and sisters are treated wrong in our country.
Right. Do any of our rabbis on this call want to weigh in? I saw so many nodding heads of rabbis. Does anybody want to? You can raise your hand if you want to add to that in any way. Okay, if you do, you just pop in the chat box if you want to interject. Kimberly, we do need to talk about voting. What a mess in Georgia.
Oh my God.
You know, we're getting to be a country where, sadly, we expect to see those long lines for elections, and hours of people just standing there waiting to vote. Like, we used to talk about other countries doing that, and we have become that on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think to make a differentiation, we saw in 2008 and 2012 lines around the block because of just sheer volume.
Right.
It was unprecedented numbers of people coming out to the polls. I think what we saw, well, I know what we saw last night or yesterday in Georgia was a complete breakdown of the voting system. That there were poll sites where their new voting system wasn't working at all, and they were telling voters that they could stand in line, but they were having to wait for a technician to come from downtown Atlanta, and it could be 45 minutes, and you know that is you know, just completely unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we have been warned time and time again about Georgia in particular, about the challenges that they have with their voting system. There would be a different governor if there was a different voting system. You know, we're seeing this over and over again from an infrastructure challenge of how, like we were just having this conversation before we started the call, that in New York, they ran out of envelopes. I mean, these are systems that should be in place, that should be guaranteed to protect the franchise, which is the thing that we as Americans pride ourselves on more than anything else, is our ability to vote and have changes in leadership that without bloodshed. And if we don't have the basic systems in place that have been, really broken down from, in some places, it is a systematic disenfranchisement of Black and brown voters. Some of it is just complete ineptitude. Some of it is the outside hacking from people who want to disrupt our democracy. But there's so much there, and just the physical act of being able to cast a vote is no longer something that is, you can just guarantee. I mean, I've been a prime voter since I turned 18, and somehow last year I was culled from rolls. And I voted in the primary and came back to vote in the general, and was told that I was not a registered voter. And I had to take it up with the Board of Elections, who then came back and said, oh yes, you are a registered voter, and we apologize for the inconvenience.
And that's because of your persistence. A lot of people would have just, let it go. I saw a quote from Bernice King this morning, Dr. King's daughter, of if voting wasn't so important, suppression wouldn't persist, right? It's not that voting is any harder than it was. It's that the effort to suppress the vote has really been ratcheted up. I do know that we have some questions in the chat. Suzanne, you want to read a question for us?
Sure. There was one on the subject of voting. Were the long lines in Georgia, do you all know if they were in certain neighborhoods, that is the African American communities, or were they across the entire state evenly?
No, it was targeted.
Yeah, it always is.
It was targeted. There's, actually, I think it's in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, have gone kind of county by county, recording the irregularities and the mirror of where the densely populated Black and brown communities had significantly more challenges than white communities, unfortunately.
The thing that I've been telling people we need to add to our civic to-do list here in New York is to get a constitutional amendment to make it possible to create a real vote-by-mail system. And one of the huge advantages of vote-by-mail is you can do it any moment in time that's convenient to you, right? The idea yesterday that people had to spend hours waiting to vote when most working people don't have that luxury is just...
and amidst the coronavirus.
And amidst the virus. Right. And I'm glad you brought up the envelope shortage, Kimberly. Of the many, many things I did not expect to happen while I was running for Congress, a national envelope shortage was certainly on the list. The shortage of the metal part you put into lawn signs was also not on the list of things I expected. It's been an interesting year. Suzanne, is there another question in the chat?
Sure. So going back to what can we do, how can past Jewish activism, Rabbi Heschel, for example, for racial justice, lend itself to today's moment in time? How do we continue to step up as a community is the question.
Rachel, I'm going to send that over to
you.
So,
firstly, I want to say hi to the rock star intern of Americans United, Zach Freeman. Hi, whose question that was. Good to see you.
That is my middle son, who was also an intern for Stacey Abrams, too.
Wow, very cool. I think that a lot of Jews take an enormous amount of pride in our history, in racial justice struggles. You know, how many of us were involved in the in the 60s in various ways as lawyers, as activists, and it is something to take pride in. It's also a point of sensitivity because the meaningful work stopped, you know, in terms of real activism. And I remember I was at the RAC, it was 2015, it was after Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and everyone else. And the Jewish reform movement, we decided that we really wanted to make racial justice, you know, we have 60 issues that we work on, and we decided we want to make racial justice the top one. And I remember this rabbi telling this really moving story, or it was a profound story of, you know, going to a rabbi who he had had a pulpit exchange with for MLK Jr. Day, and saying, you know, okay, this is like our priority now, and, you know, we're ready to go. And the pastor said, like, where have you been? Where have you been? You know, and there was work that needed to be done, like real work that wasn't superficial work, to lay the groundwork for the trust that is needed and the communication to understand what this, forget the term that we decided to go with. It wasn't, how we can be of service in the movement. And, you know, I think the movement, the Reformed Jewish movement has made real progress, you know, in doing that, but you have to put in the work. You know, I think that's the answer to the question. How can we be part of it? How can we step up as a community?
Yeah.
One of the other things, I'll just say one more thing. The majority of Jews in this country are white. Not all, right? It's like, what last I looked, it was like, according to Brandeis numbers of a research center, it's like 11% are Jews of color. So that's one thing to acknowledge. But the majority are certainly white. And a lot of white Jews, because we have felt disadvantaged because we're Jewish in certain ways in our society, and because until the 1950s, the census didn't count us as white, a lot of white Jews can be resistant to our own white privilege. And we have it. Like, if we're white, if our skin is light colored, right, we are all multifaceted people, right? So we have like certain things about us, all of us. Kim has privilege. Kim has privilege, you know, and disadvantage. I have privilege and disadvantage, right? And Kim's Black and I'm white. And I just think that for real change to happen, people who are engaging in the work need, like Kim was saying, to do some of the work on ourselves. And for that work to be real, we have to own our own white privilege if we're white and really understand it.
I think that's fascinating. Kimberly, we have an interesting question here in the chat. Somebody asks what your advice is on using the phrase people of color versus Black people.
Well, and I realize I kind of used them simultaneously. I think people of color is a term that has been used and has been coined and embraced as I think the original intent for some was to be supportive and acknowledging of people's color, but everyone is of color. You know, let's be clear. Everybody is of color, but it also is a term that perpetuates the white. Perpetuates white supremacy, that white is the norm and being of color is the other. So I think it's slipped into my language, but I tried to be very specific as much as I can, you know, referring to people as they are, because I am not Latina, I'm not Asian, I am a Black woman, and the issues and challenges are unique to my racial background, just like your issues and challenges are unique to being Jewish or being a New Yorker or, you know, being from Texas. You know, this is part of our identity, and to speak very broadly erases that and is part of erasure. So I would definitely encourage people to try and be as specific as they can, recognizing that also people don't always identify the way they present. And if someone says, well, I'm Asian, or I'm Latino, or just go with it.
Right.
Because it is their lived experience, their background, their ethnicity, and however they identify, and we should acknowledge and embrace that, but also be very clear of being very aware of the terminology that has become more of the norm, but is actually continue in an attempt to be more open, actually continues to perpetuate the supremacy cycle.
There's a further clarifying question of whether you prefer African American or Black person.
I personally use the term Black because my ancestry is from the Caribbean as well as from the American South. So I am not just African American, I am also Jamaican American, and that is a very important part of my identity. So I prefer the term Black because we want to make sure that we are acknowledging the full scope of our identity, and we don't want to have people feel like they have to choose. Yes. As folks who are multi-ethnic will say that they are multi-ethnic.
Yeah.
So I think we should continue with that.
And Allison,
yes,
just one more point on that, which is, and Kim, I'd be interested what you think of this, but some of my Black friends who I've been talking to have been actually encouraging me in this moment to use the term anti-Blackness instead of racism, because there's lots of forms of racism, but right now, in this moment, we're talking about anti-Blackness.
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
That's interesting. One thing we haven't discussed yet is how is the movement for gender equality, and we have many unapologetic feminists on this Zoom call, which is fabulous. But historically, the feminist movement has marginalized women of color often. Are either one of you, Rachel or Kimberly, are you seeing progress there in terms of inclusion?
I think it is, it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I'm also on the board of the ERA Coalition, and we have been talking about how ratifying the ERA and actually getting it into the Constitution, what that would mean for a variety of women and people in general. But I think it is definitely a process, and I think there is, to the earlier point about the work that needs to be done to build that trust.
Yes.
Because there's still a lot of distrust between Black women, Native women, Latin women, Latinas, between them and the movement, the women's movement. And I think there is a lot of work that's being done. There's a lot of conversations that are being had, but then there's also this sense of like, well, we have to do it for ourselves because we don't necessarily trust that you're going to represent all of our issues the way that they need to be represented.
Rachel, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very slow change. And I think it's a very complicated area. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but something psychological occurs to me, which is, a lot of women in the women's movement really enjoy the space to like have a voice, right? Because on some level, being a woman in our society is being more silenced, right? But in my view, what white women need to do in this movement is to kind of hold back some, to make more space. I mean, to listen and engage in this sort of genuine build trust, but also to hold back more. It doesn't mean it just means there is like a holding back. It doesn't mean not welcome, not show up. And that is, I think, a little in tension with the way the women's movement has felt very liberating for a lot of women and white women.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's some dynamic of that going on. And I think that there's a lot of, in my own, like what I see, there's a lot of sense of fragility, you know, among a lot of the white women in the movement to like, will I not be welcome here versus like, you know, what it means, like kind of what we're talking about here today, you know, what it means to make this movement inclusive.
Yes.
So we're at the early phases, I'd say.
I totally agree. I have seen, and it's counterintuitive. I have seen a fear from white women in the feminist movement of following instead of leading, of listening instead of speaking. And I think this comes from too much taking on of the old hierarchical, patriarchal models of leadership, that leadership means you're the one who's supposed to speak the most. That's why you have the gavel. And it's so enormously disempowering to other people around the table to continue to work that way. I find that really fascinating. So I'm not sure, are we seeing any more questions?
There was one about, and maybe this is to the point about who's around those tables, the question about in tech, you know, technology is so important, but people of color in tech are a real minority. How do we get more people of color into tech at all levels, including board level?
STEM, you invest in STEM, right? One of my, I hope you all don't mind if I lead on this one. I think I'm the leading nerd here. Not to reduce your nerddom at all. And Kimberly, I do know you are pretty nerdy. I do know that for a fact. But of the cracks in society that have been incredibly increased through the pandemic, the lack of access to tech for kids we sent home for homeschooling is absolutely egregious, and they are falling way behind in this moment in time. And it's also about the inequities of school funding, which is the first issue that you brought up, Kimberly, right? And the inequitable distribution of resources in our country. One of the things that breaks my heart, and Howard, I don't know if you know Charles Best. I've known Charles Best for a long time. He's the founder of Donors Choose. And I struggle so much with the fact that we as a country need to have Donors Choose, an online platform for teachers to go and beg for supplies. I have a dear friend who's been a public school teacher in Memphis for years, and she just retired early, she said, because I cannot spend another minute begging for supplies. That is not an equitable country for us to have. Any other questions? Rachel, anything else you would want to bring up on this topic of how to help folks get really engaged in this movement?
Just that I just think it's easy to, easy for this moment, too easy for this moment to come and go for white people, and that, you know, Black and brown people don't, like, never can leave this issue, right? And that white people can, and that, you know, sometimes we choose to because, you know, we're uncomfortable. But I just want to say two things about that. One is there's a comedian online who tells the story about, like, white people can't look at addressing racism and their own privilege and their own as having an appendectomy, because, like, addressing your racism in society, all that is much more like dental hygiene. It's like you have to do it every day. And if someone says to you, but you have a piece of food in your teeth, you don't say, but I brushed my teeth last night. It's like, yeah, every day and every day. And that's what John Lewis, I think, you know, the wonderful, you know, John Lewis was saying today in the paper. And that's what maybe some of you have read about or read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But there's a really nice quote of his too. And it, again, you know, it can evoke some feelings. And let me just see if I can find it, because I pulled it because I wanted to read it to you all. It says, an anti-racist is someone who deliberately is confessing the racist ideas that have been nurtured within them while trying to be better, trying to be different and trying to support policies that create equity. So I would just like, that would be, I am someone who's in this, who led a conversation on Monday for my organization, and in front of all my staff had to do a, ooh, that came out that was an ouch. That didn't come out right. Literally, the more of this work as a white person that you do, which makes you educate yourself, you're sometimes in dialogue with Black and brown people, sometimes you're reading, whatever, it's hard, the more challenging moments you will have, but ultimately you know that you're working towards benefiting your own humanity, you know, and the humanity of everyone, Black and brown people in our society. So I would just say, stay the course.
Stay the course. Okay, Kimberly, 3 things we need to do individually to make sure, to really make sure this moment in time is different. What do we do?
To Rachel's point, be constantly thinking and assessing the space that you occupy, and who is in that space, who is not in that space, how much space are you taking up? Are you taking up more than your share? Are you pushing others forward? I think that is something that is, that can be really culture changing if more people see and agree to be that self-aware about how we all stand in a space and speaking to who is not in the space or whose voices are not being heard. I think absolutely to commit to being an anti-racist and continuously day in and day out do that internal work and have the conversation, have the difficult conversations with your friends and colleagues and family about injustice and how it is not something that is convenient or not convenient to deal with, because there are people who cannot escape it. They wake up, they go to sleep, as someone years ago, a comedian said, the one thing that I have to do that I cannot change is be Black and die. So being very aware of that it is not something that that many can choose to do. So you should not choose to do it. You should be, as part of your humanity and your compassion for other people, to be that self-aware and to do that work. And then lastly, if you have resources, if you have time, if you have expertise, lend it to the movement and support organizations, and really think about how are you in your philanthropy, in your business dealings, in how you spend your recreational dollars. Are you supporting Black businesses? Are you supporting minority-owned businesses? Because that also helps shift how it shifts the injustice. If we actually spent the time to invest in organizations, in companies, in people, ultimately you're investing in people.
And of course, it was minority-owned businesses that got the least amount of the stimulus money that just came out. Rachel, in our Jewish community, sometimes we hear people say that Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic. What do you think? I think you're on mute, honey.
I don't agree at all. And I think, I think that there's a cartoon that emerged in 2015 that perhaps is the best way to explain why I don't agree, which is there's like a strip of houses and there's a fireman who arrives with a hose, and one of the houses is on fire, and the caption reads, "All houses matter."
Well, there you go. There you go. I really want to be respectful of everybody's time. And I am so grateful to Kimberly, of course, to Rachel, to all of you for showing up for this conversation. As white people, as Kimberly said, we need to spend our privilege. We need to be of service. We need to make sure this moment counts, that we really are bending the arc of history towards justice in this moment in time. No time to waste. I hope you're all well. I hope you're safe and healthy. And I'm grateful that you took this hour to spend with us. So thank you and stay well.